everybody. Welcome to the Goot Reaction. I'm your host, Joe Goot, and with me, as always, is my main man from the Midwest. We're here tonight with an episode that's actually a bonus episode, a quick follow-up to our Fight Club episode that we did recently. And we touched on a lot of different things in that episode, but there were a couple aspects that we thought could use a little more exploration, specifically around the politics of Fight Club, specifically the characters within and their motivations and their ideas, and then expanding a little more on the religious aspect of it. So we both had some additional thoughts throughout the week that we thought would be interesting to share. So we'll start with the politics side of it. And we talked a lot about nihilism in the episode, and really nihilism is sort of an anti-political mindset, really. And so it feels a little bit strange for these characters in Project Mayhem to sort of have a political viewpoint as well. But I think the closest thing that would line up with how they were acting in the movie and how they structured themselves would be almost like socialism, but with a dictator. And the reason why I say that is in socialism, the workers own the means of production. And so it does seem like something that lines up pretty well with their philosophy in terms of being self-sufficient, in terms of making their own soap, making their own money with that, kind of doing their own production line at the house, and really just being self-reliant, not relying on the state to provide anything for them, which is a little bit different than, traditional Scandinavian socialism, for example, where you may pay high taxes, but then you get a lot of benefits in return. For them, it feels like socialism in that everyone's equal and they have things provided for them, but they're sort of providing them for themselves instead of relying on a state to provide them those services, even though they are still within the system. I mean, you have to operate within the system that exists. And so in America, we live in a capitalistic democracy. And so they were living within that system. But I think if they had their way, it seems like the closest thing to what they had structured was sort of a socialistic approach, but with the dictator being Tyler Durden, who orchestrated everything and sort of made the rules up, and oftentimes on the fly. And so they had their strongman, they had their person that they would look up to. And that goes back to the cult thing that we were talking about a little bit as well, with that sort of mentality of worshiping, whether they knew it or not, worshiping their cult leader. And so sort of a weird mishmash of a lot of different things. You've got the nihilistic philosophy on one hand, you've got sort of a socialist structure, but with a dictator. And then you have this overall aspect of that it's really similar to a cult in a lot of ways. So it is hard to pin down one specific political framework that I felt would be the best match for what they're doing. But that was my initial thought on that.
Yes, I'm going to actually maybe challenge a few things there. So yeah. I didn't know that's where you were going to go, but let's... okay, so where do I start? I think about it, and I don't know if you watched the show The Last of Us on HBO. It was based off the video game of the same name.
I did not know.
There was a point in that show where, spoiler alert to anybody who hasn't watched it, but as they're traveling around the country in this zombie wasteland apocalypse, I think it's in Montana or Wyoming or something, they come across this community that's figured out how to kind of protect themselves and live within this boundary. And when one of the people that runs it is explaining to one of the main characters that it's a commune and they're all contributing what they can and their different skill sets and that, and he has sort of a reaction that you mean communism, right? And so when I think about what they were doing in Fight Club, it actually seemed to fit that sort of definition for me of sort of that communism type idea. And I never really thought of Tyler so much as a dictator, but as just their leader. Because I think even in the because there's no they sort of worshipped him, but I don't think he really demanded that they do so. You know what I mean? And that seems like the difference to me.
Mm.
So it seems like maybe more of a kind of a real inspirational leader. And I'm not familiar with the full politics of all the Scandinavian countries, but when I think about the democratic socialist countries, they still have some kind of leader that runs the system that they some
Yeah.
form of government that runs the system that they operate in. And when I think about socialism with a dictator, I think that points to all of the when people really want to denigrate that system or those kind of systems, those are the worst examples that we always hear of, right?
Right.
Stalin, even Hitler,
National
calling
socialist. Yeah.
yeah, calling themselves a system that's for the people. But what really ruins it and happens is that there's a dictator in place who's siphoning all the, even Putin
Mm.
today is siphoning all the funds actually up to themselves, to their oligarch friends, you know what I mean, and not dispersing it back to the people. So it's not been a system that actually benefits those people that are contributing to it. But that's what, anytime there's a discussion, and I'm not advocating for one system or another necessarily, but anytime you want to have some kind of healthy, intelligent discussion about it, there's so many people that go, no, it's never worked before. It's like, yeah, the systems you're pointing to are ones that had a dictator in place ruining everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, especially bringing up sort of in your opinion, what was maybe more communism versus socialism. And I do have to agree that part of that is probably accurate in that most communist societies. So think of the Chinese Communist Party, for example. Like they have maybe a national philosophy, but they oppressing the Uyghur minorities who are, I believe, Muslim. They don't like Stalin was famously was against any kind of religion because that is a threat to the communist order. It's a threat to the people in charge, and so that would kind of fit in with the nihilist thing because they don't believe in any religious authority or any religious system that they would live under. So that is kind of interesting. However, in communism, I guess maybe, I mean, the more I think about it, maybe that is more accurate just because I
And
think also, oh, go
real
ahead.
quick, I was just gonna say I don't know if that fits the technical textbook definitions of things, but it made me
Right.
think of that situation in that other show, which all the explanation rolled together for him to get to, well, communism, but it was the
Hmm.
collective people working together. You know what I mean? So, like I said, that may not be the
Yeah.
fit the textbook definition of it.
Right. Yeah. Because I think, then you're starting to get into the state owning all the property and all the means of production versus the people owning those things, and which is the main distinction between the two systems. But in their system, there really wasn't. I mean, yes, technically there were things to own. I mean, I guess they were basically squatting in that house, so there really wasn't, the property to own or anything. But the means of production, they were all involved in that. They were all making their own food, and they brought their own clothing and burial money, and that was about it. But then they were making the soap and sort of again in that self-sustaining way. So there's that aspect of it. But then there's also another thing that you said that perked my ears up a little bit was the kind of the community owned aspect, which is sort of the collective idea where you have, instead of a corporation, you have an actual community owned, like community bank or a community collective grocery store where all the employees own the actual store. So I think that aspect is closer, and you can even have that. Obviously we have those here, so you can have those within a capitalist excuse me, a capitalist society. It's just a different structure of ownership, and so I think that maybe at the end of the day, then they're not really subscribing to one of those two, of socialism or communism necessarily, even though there's parallels to, I think, both, but they're more structured in an employee owned way versus the traditional capitalist setup of workers and stockholders and that kind of, in a board and that kind of thing. So they're definitely not that. But I will say though that I do think I will defend a little bit the Tyler as dictator, just because he's very secretive about what the actual plans are. He doesn't really share a whole lot. It's up to him to which direction Project Mayhem goes, and it is pretty much everything at his direction. Now, I'm not saying that he demanded their worship or whatever, but essentially he demanded they give up their identities and submit to the identity of the collective instead of any personal or individual identity. And so that's where you start getting into more of the cult aspect of it specifically. But I do think that there's elements of him as a dictator rather than just a leader who's just along for the ride, let's say, but just happens to be the most charismatic person in the group.
So what's interesting there is we felt as viewers sympathizing with Jack that Tyler was keeping everything secret. But if you look at all the people Jack talked to and interacted with that were part of the Project Mayhem, they all seemed to know what was going on. So I don't know that he was necessarily keeping it secret from everybody. He was it was the alter ego, the other personality that wasn't privy to it. So he was actually kind of keeping that distance in his own mind, I think maybe because he didn't want to know. He didn't want to admit to himself how far Tyler was taking things.
Yeah.
Well, like we'll never know without going into understanding more about what the author was getting at. But one other thing I wanted to touch on too was I feel like what we're seeing with them, with that Project Mayhem and the way they're operating in the house is almost what I'd call is it like entry-level communism, where they're still small enough that they haven't really had to have a governing body, you know what I mean, form, other than obviously, like I said, Tyler's just kind of the de facto leader. But is it, is it a matter of scale? Like if they got big enough right within that, and I'm thinking about like in The Last of Us 2, that was pretty big group of people because there's been a safe haven from the zombies, but they had some kind of council or something where, they said, okay, we do need like a level of decision making to kind of represent our best interests. Now, one wrong person steps in and takes over that and starts demanding certain things. So that's your path to the dictatorship, I think, there, versus more of a democratic situation. I also, just one last thing too.
Sure.
And in a lot of cases like that, people do need some direction. I think everybody always wants to think, oh yeah, we could just operate independently and do what we want. But I've told you before, I always use the parking lot analogy. If you want to know if people need direction or not, go to a parking lot when it snows and look at how people behave. A lot of people need those lines to tell them exactly where to park to get the right number of cars in that parking lot. If it's snowing and you can't see those lines, you'll get like 3/4 the number of cars you should in that parking lot, because people can't just operate with direction. I was at the football game the other night, and there's a lot of places where people park and there's not designated lines, and there's 4 feet between every car. And it's like, you could fit twice as many cars in this area if people would just park a good distance away from each other, as would be dictated by parking spaces. But you take those away and everybody just does what they want. You know what I mean? There's no... Anyway.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. It also makes me think of what might have, and I haven't done a lot of research into this, so this is just a little bit of speculation on top of some basic reading, but the Bolshevik Revolution, and how to get to the Tsar and his family, they must have, the communists must have had some inside people, and that's kind of the setup they had with Project Mayhem. They had the cops that were on the project, and you had the bartender, and you had the service workers, and you had restaurant workers. You had basically people had infiltrated, by the end of it, had infiltrated almost every level of society. And so when they were ready, then that's what enabled them to essentially start the revolution. And so that's what kind of made me think. And of course, then that's funny that in that example that I'm giving, that is a communist example. So maybe I think there's more to your idea than the socialism, probably. So I think you're onto something there.
Well, and what's interesting there is if they had really gotten enough people on their side, which it seemed like they did. There's fight clubs all over the place, and just even then when Jack goes to the police to try to spill the beans on everything that's happening, 3 of the 4 police officers in that room are part of Project Mayhem. Yep. Boy, they really were acting as representatives of the people. then at that point,
Yeah.
right? Because if enough people were involved and enough people wanted that to happen, well, that's a representative government right there.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so let's shift a little bit to talk about the religious angle. And I was listening to a podcast the other day that was talking about in in this case it was the evangelical uh, groups and their apostolic reformation and the seven mountains and all those sorts of things, and specifically in the context of politics and how they were really trying to influence the right wing especially. And it got me thinking about the the religious aspect of Fight Club again. And I know in the episode we talked about how the ending was almost like a stand-in for a parallel to the rapture and sort of this grand reset and creating this new utopia for believers. And what that made me think of as well then was another parallel, especially so I grew up Catholic, and in the Catholic Church we were kind of encouraged to suffer. I know this may sound odd to some people that aren't familiar with the traditions of the Catholic Church, or maybe it was just the group that I was involved in at the time when I was young. But there was sort of this encouragement to suffer as Jesus and the apostles did, again, according to the stories, for their faith. And so, for one example, I remember going to this retreat in Cleveland, and we spent the whole weekend doing retreat type things, praying and sharing stories and communing and bonding and doing all those religious sorts of things that youth groups do. And at the end of the retreat on Sunday morning, we went to Mass, and it was in this old, like really big old traditional Catholic church in Cleveland. And the marble steps on this place, they're everywhere. So just marble, marble, marble. And they encouraged us to kneel for the entire mass. And so mass, traditional mass especially, can be an hour plus easy. And so they had rows and rows of us kids kneeling on marble for an hour, and I thought my knees were going to just explode. It felt like they were bleeding through my pants by halfway through this damn mass. And that was what we were encouraged to do. No one said like you have to do this, but that was sort of the thing, is that you were encouraged to suffer for your beliefs. And so that got me thinking of the parallel with Fight Club as well, where they were encouraged to suffer for different purposes, of course, than just believing in some religious moral authority or whatever. That wasn't the point of it, but they were suffering, and that was part of sort of this celebration of creating meaning and celebrating life in their own way. So it was a different means to an end. But for me, I just thought that was an interesting parallel because like I said, as a Catholic growing up, we were also encouraged to suffer, but for different reasons. So that was a interesting thought I had.
So, what aspect in Fight Club are you necessarily referring to as the suffering? The
So I'm
actual.
talking about pretty much the actual fighting itself, when they're literally in the ring and they're just going at it and going at it. And then, like we talked about in the episode too, where they embrace at the end of it. And so it's a celebration of the suffering, not just suffering for suffering's sake.
Yeah, see, I guess I'm not sure. I think they see that as suffering. I think they see that as a means to feel alive and feel that thing that they're not otherwise feeling in their life, and it's that little bit of maybe the embrace of the pain and the like Jack works in an office, mundane life, never hardly physically challenged to do anything. Um, so I guess I'm not even sure that I think they see that as suffering necessarily.
Well, but that's the exact point though, because it's the same thing in the church. It's not, well, in that case, it is recognizing quote unquote sacrifice or feeling pain, but it is to feel closer to God, to feel closer to Jesus, who suffered and died for the sins, etc. So I think it's still physically pain, that they're going through in Fight Club. They're still feeling something that I think the average person would say that would be some sort of suffering or pain. But again, agreed that it's not it's not specifically for that. It's to achieve something else, and they get something else out of it. So it's partly I guess it would be maybe more selfish in the Fight Club realm versus for a different purpose for the community, for church, for God, to give glory to God, etc. When you're in the church setting, maybe different motivations, but still, to me, those are, I think, very close parallels.
Yeah, I guess maybe feeling the suffering in the moment to feel that feeling of being alive and joy after. Yeah, I guess. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I can see where you're going with that.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I don't want to rehash too much of what we already went over in the other episode, but yeah, we just wanted to follow up with a couple additional thoughts on those two topics from the episode, just because there's again so much that came out of that, and it was so fun to just research and do the Fight Club episode. So yeah,
Even though I've seen that movie so many times, like I said, I watched it again recently, and I've still been kind of dying to go watch it again. So yeah, just a classic. Holds up.
absolutely, absolutely. And I was talking with a buddy at work who has read the book, and he said it's very, very similar all the way until the ending. And so, and I was trying to pry a little bit, and he was like, "No, I'm not going to tell you because you should read it." So, yeah. So now I definitely want to read the book because, yeah, if it's a very close parallel all the way up until, like, how would Polniak have ended that differently given everything leading up to it being basically the same as in the movie? So I'm very curious now.
I do have a copy of it somewhere that I think, in true Marla Singer style, I bought off of like a secondhand, discount store shelf. So I'll have to find it and dig in.
Nice. Well, I got my the jeans I'm wearing now from some random person's dryer in the laundromat, so we're good.
Nice.
Just kidding. So, all right. So we will leave it there. And again, thanks for joining us, everybody. Hope you liked the episode, and we'll talk again soon.